Dr. Khoza, welcome and thanks very much for giving us your time tonight on Kaya.
Thank you very much and thanks for having me.
I want to step away from your personal role and some of the things you've said and done and ask you a question about Parliament, because during the hearings in particular into the SABC, there was a sense amongst many people that they were seeing an institution come to life that they believed had been somewhat passive over many, many years. Is that accurate? And if it is accurate, tell us what's been going on.
Well, I do think that it is, to a very large extent, accurate. The members of the ANC, I think they are coming to the realization that the oversight function is not an exclusive preserve of the opposition, but they themselves have a role to play in holding the executive to account. And that's exactly what happened during the SABC hearing.
What would you say, though, to the people who are concerned that this only happens when the ANC is divided internally? In other words, people do it to express a factional view, but it isn't an expression of a deeper commitment to democracy and Parliament's role in that.
Well, yes and no. There is a level where you think that where factionalism, you can see it, you can feel it. But certainly in the committees that I've served in, I've been the chair on the selection of the public protector process. All the ANC members in that committee, they did not seem to be aligned to any particular faction during that process. And again, when I was in the SABC inquiry,
yes,
there didn't seem to be that. But obviously, there is going to be a lot of reading on how we behave, what we say, because everybody sees themselves as belonging to this faction or that faction.
I wonder what your view is on a further questioning, I guess, because there's no doubt that people appreciate a much livelier Parliament, but I think the level of interrogation underneath that is important as well. A sense that the democratic institutions kick into action once the horse is over the hill and has travelled a long, long distance and is gone. In other words, we hear from the Auditor General when the money's already gone. We hear from the Public Protector on Nkandla when the money is spent. We hear from Parliament on the SABC when untold damage has already been done. Do you share that concern, and perhaps do you have some ideas as to how those watchdog institutions can kick in sooner?
You know, to be honest with you, I honestly think that we have not invested sufficiently on developing the capacity of members of Parliament to perform their oversight function effectively. And I do think that for a very long time, as the ANC, we've been in the liberation movement mode. In other words, you know, each time you have to hold the executive to account, you get into the liberation mode, yes, where you unite, even when there are things that are actually going wrong. And I don't think that that's the intention of democracy. I think we've got to graduate from that liberation mode into the democratic party politics, where everyone who is in the legislative arm of government is playing their role in holding the executive accountable.
Why did you get into politics?
It's a very, very, well, I got involved in politics because everyone who was black during my time in the 1980s were all involved in politics. But recently, because I only came back to politics again in 2014, I was actually elected by the branches in absentia. I had resigned from the KZN legislature in 2012 as the chief whip there and also as the chair of SCOPA. But the branches of the ANC felt that I needed to come back to politics, and that's how I came back. It was a very difficult decision, but because I have the love of the people at heart, I agreed.
Let's go back a little bit to that time of growing up in the 1980s. Pietermaritzburg was your home?
Yeah.
A scene, a part of the country like Gauteng, but more particularly like KZN. Very, very rough community politics, very brutal, very violent, deadly politics, clashes between the ANC and the IFP. Does it sadden you that so many years on from that, presumably you would have seen people close to you lose their lives, perhaps people close to you take lives, that we appear to be heading back into a violent politics, not of this on the same scale? because I don't want to be alarmist, but nevertheless, do you see trends that worry you and bring back old memories?
Definitely. Definitely. I'm from KZN, and I can tell you that I have personal friends who have been killed. I have counselors who have been killed on their way to work, or sometimes when they are coming in at home. Recently, as you know, a municipal manager in Richmond was murdered, and a deputy mayor also was murdered. So you have a lot of that. It is scary, because what is happening is that there is a feeling that people tend to, they don't want to be held accountable, because if you are holding them accountable, there is a huge and the ultimate price to pay. And I think that is very unfortunate in a democratic dispensation.
We'll come back to some of those issues, and let me just invite people to call in again. Our guest is Dr. Makhosi Khoza, Member of Parliament for the African National Congress. You may well have seen her involved in the inquiry into the SABC. She's spoken out very openly about her concerns about the African National Congress and where it's going at the moment. On the 9th of April on Facebook, you sat down to write. I'll read something near the end of your piece, which is, people will have read it. People who haven't, I'll post up a link. But you said, our land redress, radical economic transformation, and united non-racial and non-sexism are just and fair battles. However, we are standing on an immoral platform from which we launch our attacks on oppressive systems. As a result, we are depleted and ultimately will be defeated as our goals wait for a new morally inspired tackle. Was there any point, I don't know if you wrote this in the early morning or the mid-morning, whenever it was there any point at which your fingers paused on the keyboard and you said, maybe not backspace, or were you absolutely clear about what you wanted to say and why?
I try not to be ambiguous.
Okay.
On what I need to say. And what is there that I posted on my Facebook wall is exactly the true reflection of who I am and how I felt at that moment.
You talk about not being ambiguous, but you have grown up politically within the African National Congress, which, like many organizations, has a sense of party discipline, that you speak boldly, you speak bluntly, you debate robustly, but you do it within a frame. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So you can be unambiguous, but you don't necessarily take it to Facebook. What was the step that took you from those parameters with their limitations, but some would argue their disciplines, which may be more effective, into something a little bit less predictable in its outcome?
Well, I'm a firm believer that a liberation movement has to evolve.
Yes.
And I also believe that a liberation movement has to embrace a digital revolution. And the social media, for example, offers us a very good platform from which to share our views and perspectives, and from which to be persuaded and be influenced. So I do not have a problem with that at all.
Have you been frustrated by your attempts within whatever structures you might have engaged to raise the issues that have been concerning you? It would seem for quite some time. This was not your first post, by the way. I think I should make that clear to anyone who hasn't been to your Facebook page.
Well, the truth be told, in a fictionalized environment, it's very, very difficult to express yourself. And again, in an environment that is riddled with patronage politics, it's very difficult to get a genuine response when you are raising issues, because in an environment like that, people tend to think with their stomachs and not with their heads. And most of the time you are likely to get a frustrated expectation. So it is frustrating, but it's not insurmountable as long as we are taking our position whenever possible. And when I posted what I posted on Facebook, it was my personal views. I cannot move against the collective, that is true. And I'm bound by the collective decisions. But that does not take away my freedom of speech.
I'm trying to picture you on April the 9th. You've just posted it. Did you sit at your computer and wait, or did you switch it off and put the kettle on?
Well, I actually did it on my iPhone.
You did all of that on your phone?
Yes.
Okay,
I did
you
it
have
on
very
my
quick
iPhone.
thumbs. Okay.
Yes, I did it on my iPhone. And as you know, and you've already alluded to that, I'm from Pietermaritzburg.
Yes.
On the 7th, I actually happened to decide that, you know what, maybe I need to go and see my mother in Pietermaritzburg, because my mother lives in Maritzburg and I live in Hillcrest.
Right.
And when I got to Pietermaritzburg, I could not believe the number of people that were marching. And it actually reminded me of Mike Getting's, you know, there was once a big march, the cricketer, London cricketer, you know, and I was part of that march. Mm-hmm. And something was telling me that something is fundamentally wrong, and it will be wrong of me to keep quiet. So on Sunday, I was reading my newspapers, and as you probably know, there were these headlines, very disturbing headlines. Some of them were actually labeling the marchers as racist and that kind of thing. And I felt that my voice also has to be heard, because I did not see racism. I saw South Africans genuinely standing up together and for a common goal, and that is to protect the future of their children and to protect their own country.
Is your mother a sounding board on the decisions you make? Is she interested in politics? Some background on her?
Well, my mother is a rural woman, mm-hmm. and she has a lot of wisdom, mm-hmm. and I think my mother and my grandmother have a very, very big impact on my life, big influence on my life, because they always told me that always stand for the truth and pursue the truth in life, so that you live not to have regrets.
Let's go to the lines. Litladi is ringing us from Sebokeng. Just to reintroduce my guest, Dr. Makhosi Khoza. We're talking about the ANC. We're talking about Parliament. She's a member of Parliament, as I'm sure you know. We're going to talk a little bit later about some of her academic work, and we're very, very keen to get your calls and thoughts as well. So, Litladi, over to you.
Hi, John. How are you?
Well, and you?
I'm good. Dr. Khoza, how are you?
I am fine, Litladi.
I'm fine. Dr. Khoza, I just want to compliment you and ask one question from you. Firstly, let me compliment you, Dr. Khoza, that in the work you have done for the ruling party, you brought hope to people like me who have lost hope to the ruling party. With your fair comments, especially, I must confess that I didn't know a lot about you, but I started knowing about you after the SABC inquiries. And
yes,
not necessarily before the SABC, which was
the
this
public
one of
protector.
The selection of the public protector.
Interview of the public protector. And what I would like to comment you about it is that you have shown that in South Africa, no matter the organization that the ideological difference of the organization, our leaders can work together towards the common goal for the people of South Africa, and we have done that with excellence. And secondly, I just have a question. If the people, like you have just told us that you were asked you were voted by the people in your area to come back in politics.
Yes.
What if the very same people come to you and ask you to run for the presidency in the ANC? Will you accept that?
Well, let me tell you, I'm within the ANC, and one of the things that I've observed from the ruling party is that we have not invested in building or in strengthening the oversight function of Parliament, and I would therefore prefer to perform the oversight function. In other words, to be on the legislative side as opposed to the executive side. Because the way it's been playing out, it's like going for the executive function, it's a promotion and it's a demotion to be in the legislative side. If somebody with the kind of qualifications that I have sits in the legislative side, I think it augurs well for the legislative sector.
Carbo has this question. Carbo is using the Today with John Perlman Facebook page. Please use it. Use my Twitter account as well. You can follow me there at John Perlman. And of course, call in 086 00 00959. Carbo's question: can you please ask Dr. Khoza if she's in favor of a secret ballot or a show of hands, and why? I assume that Carbo's referring to the vote of no confidence, should that all play out as when it eventually does.
You know, to me, I really, in fact, part of the reason why I wrote that, I penned down that article on the injudiciousness of the ANC leadership, I really don't think that we should have gone to that extent where, as members of parliament, we have to choose whether to vote for or against. The reason being that if we are claiming that we are a leader of society, you ought to be exemplary. Now, we've had 7 votes of no confidence.
Yes.
And this is the 8th one. And it bothers me that each time we have to go and flex our quantitative muscle as the ruling party. And I don't think we should be doing that. I think the ruling party ought to be taking a decisive decision. How are they going to do it? I am not sure. But maybe even if they had come out to say, we've heard you South Africans, give us a chance. We have a policy conference in June and we have an elective conference in December. And after that, we are promising you that a solution will be coming. Maybe something like that would have worked better than simply saying, go to parliament, vote this way or that way.
Isn't one of the difficulties, though, that in a sense you are a family in the African National Congress? It's a family that, if you take the longer timeline of the progressive movement during the years when the ANC was unbanned, the difficulties of being in the UDF and then the ANC and KZN, all of those things, those experiences are multiplied across an entire party. Is this not to some degree the natural defensiveness of a family in regard to criticism from outsiders?
No, I think it's the difficulty to shift from being a liberation movement,
yes,
to becoming a democratic political party and operating in a dispensation that has constitutionalism in it. And this trend we've seen even in all the African countries. If you look at all the African countries, once they get to 20 years, we start seeing this thing, which we are experiencing in South Africa. The liberation movement begins to decline. And I think it's because we don't want to adjust. Remember that during the liberation struggle, there are no elections to speak of.
Yes.
You are merely there because of your conviction. Now we have the members of society that vote for us in power. For example, in the ANC, we were voted by over 11 million people, South Africans, but we only have less than 1 million members. And so we need to be able to understand that we are not leading our party. We are leading the broader society.
I want to ask you this. When people within the ANC speak out, this is more often leveled against people who have been, for example, ministers and then move on. But they say, why are you speaking now and you didn't speak earlier? And my question to you would be this, because I know your return to Parliament is not particularly long ago, 2014, I think you said. But were there moments much earlier than this when you thought, I need to say something, or somebody needs to say something, and that moment would then pass where you'd make a different tactical decision or a different personal one?
Maybe I might say to you, I had always taken decisions.
Yes.
And the most recent one was when we took a decision as the ANC, the African National Congress Provincial Executive Committee in KwaZulu-Natal, and I was the spokesperson at that time, and I was also in the PEC, the Executive Committee. We had decided, because the Msunduzi municipality, which is Pietermaritzburg, had completely collapsed.
Yes.
So we had to recall the leadership that was running that municipality, which we believed were the causes of the collapse of the municipality. And post the elections, the local government elections, the PEC decided that no, one of the people must become the deputy mayor. I decided to, I decided my conscience would not allow me
yes.
to be part of betraying the messages that I was carrying throughout the election campaign. So I called on that particular deputy mayor to resign. And the newspapers in KZN, they actually did broadcast that. It was Alpha Shilembe, and I did it.
Yeah.
So it's not the first time that I'm doing it. It's something that sometimes can be career limiting if your sole purpose, your motive for participation in politics is to get promotion.
Yes.
Now, with me, I'm not in politics because I want to get a promotion.
086 00 959. Osborne in Crystal Park wants to talk about some of the ANC's political traditions and history. Good evening, Osborne.
Good evening, Dr. John, and what a human being that you have there. I respect her as a human being, but I really don't support the party that she's in. It's okay, though. Just one quick question to the dear MP. I love your work within, those particular forums in which you get to ask those particular questions. My question deals with leadership. If we speak of leadership today, are we not putting the cart before the horse in as far as we failed to define what a South African is, and yet now we want to define what a leader should be? People like Bantu Biko, we celebrate them today, but do we really celebrate what they stood for? They spoke of black consciousness movements, and that spoke about liberation of the mind. Did we liberate Africans or South Africans so that they can become model citizens, so that even today when there are protests, they think about tomorrow and protest in a different manner than what we see today? Would we see the kind of leaders that we see today had we addressed the issue of liberating the mind?
Osborne, thanks. A very profound question. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, my answer to that is that Osborne is correct. We have not invested enough in decolonizing the mind. What we have invested a lot in is to deliver material things such as housing, delivering water and so forth, addressing those basic needs. Yet, if you are a free individual, it also matters what you think, what goes into your mind, how you view society, how you process the issues, and those kinds of things. And I do think that we ought to have spent more time in defining the kind of society that we want. We do have the Constitution that does say, which is our collective moral signature, but the Constitution, I don't think, has been given enough expression outside the constitutional parameters, outside the constitutional courts or whatever. And I think as political parties, we ought to be deepening that even in our own political education. There is no more time now we tend to spend more time teaching people about the National Democratic Revolution, yes, or Marxism or whatever. And we never really move people forward into also thinking about what does it mean to be a constitutional democracy? What is your responsibility as a citizen in a constitutional democracy? And I think that is very important.
You grew up, though, Dr. Khoza, with rural roots, as you described to us earlier, referring to your mom and where she still lives. What do you say to people who say those are the conversations of the comfortable, and they're very hard for people to get their heads around when they're wondering if, when they turn the tap on, the water will be there, and if it's going to be drinkable? How do we make those national conversations that transcend class and need, and allow people the space to say, you know what, in addition to all those things, I want to think and I want to express my view?
It is extremely important to balance the basic needs and the decolonization of the mind.
Yes.
Because when, you must understand part of the reason why we have these challenges. If you've been, as a journalist, you've seen a lot of service delivery protests, and some of them you will build a library today that we delivered, and the following day it's burnt down. And they kind of disassociate themselves from this library. They don't understand that if you are burning down the library,
Yes.
you are actually hurting yourself. And that's what we are talking about. We are not saying we shouldn't be delivering basic services. And therefore, the issue of the constitutionalism, of decolonizing the mind is extremely important. Another area that is very close to my heart, look at the business linguistic landscape in South Africa.
Yes.
That remains unchanged. And if we are not going to be engaging in those conversations and actually talking about language as economics, because language is not just for communication,
Yes.
it's also economics. If you can speak English, you have more access to opportunities. But we have not elevated African languages. As a result, to speak an African language, no matter how proficient we are, it's not going to open business opportunities for you.
So while we're on that subject, because I was going to come to that later, but this is a good moment. Tell us, I've just read very briefly about your own studies and academic work on the Zulu language. What did you set out to do and how far have you got?
Well, my son is a computer programmer,
Right.
and he asked me to assist him with developing a system for isiZulu language. He was very frustrated when he was reading the dictionaries of isiZulu and textbooks and so forth, which tended to omit the prefix vowel. And now in isiZulu, if you omit the prefix vowel, there's a clear distinction between a noun and a verb.
Right.
Like in English, work could be a noun and it could be a verb. In isiZulu, you can't have that. If it's a noun, it will be umsebenzi or umsebenzi. Or if it's a verb, it's a sebenza. So in other words, it doesn't have a prefix vowel.
Right.
If you omit the prefix vowel, therefore, you are actually turning this noun word into a verb word, which is incorrect. And again, you must remember, isiZulu does not only work on the basic three quantification of nouns, which is singularity, plurality, and uncountable nouns.
Yes.
It has 12 distinct nouns,
Right.
6,000 nouns, and it's very important. And those nouns are driven by the vowel.
I'm assuming you didn't do all of this on your iPhone.
Well, I didn't do it on my iPhone. There was a lot of research I had
I
to
can
do because
imagine.
I'm not a linguist, actually. I went into that linguistic space because my son wanted me to. That's the price you pay to be for being a mother.
And tell us, once you got into it, was it consuming? I mean, was it a passion, and did you discover things that you might want to do perhaps when you're not in politics?
Let me tell you something. I've actually discovered that I wanted to pursue that.
Yes.
Because I've discovered that Abantu languages, they are very similar. All of them. In the whole of the continent. And if there is one thing I would love to do is to actually produce a dictionary of Abantu languages that will be, because I discovered that, like in Shona, Imbuzi is Imbuchi, and those kinds of things. In Zulu, it is Imbuzi. And if you look at all Abantu languages, they have very common, they have the intelligence of the languages are the same. They are all noun cluster based. Most of them are actually vowel driven and sound unit driven. In other words, they always go, each word must have both the consonant and the vowel.
I want to ask you in a moment how that kind of in-depth study and shaping and codifying, I guess I'm struggling for words here because this is new to me, of languages tips the kind of balance of economic power that you're talking about to the extent that power is embedded in language.
One of the things that I actually discovered is that isiZulu is mathematically formulated.
Yes.
And as you know, mathematics and science are subjects of prosperity, if you know what I mean. And like, for example, with isiZulu, if the learners were actually taught isiZulu using the mathematical approach that I'm proposing.
Right.
Like, for example, in isiZulu, everything is about patterns.
Yes.
Maths is the study of patterns. And if you look at isiZulu, if you take any verb word of isiZulu, in its basic form, it always ends with an A. like hlala, hamba, thula, gijima, tula, and so forth. But if you negate that, it then becomes an I at the end. So ungahambi, ungahlali, ungathuli, and so forth. Now, if we begin to teach our children that way, we are beginning to inculcate the language of mathematics very young, and the methodical thinking as well, because in isiZulu you can go for the agglutinative method, which is a compounded way of writing, or you can isolate speech elements, and there are rules that you need to follow. So we have not exploited or leveraged on the strengths that we have in our language. And if we do, I'm sure at some point we will be seeing more African children as well, being competent in mathematics and science.
086 00959. Pagamani in Boipatong has been holding for a while. Good evening to you. Pagamani, welcome to the show.
How are you, sir?
Fine, and yourself?
Yes, I'm very happy to listen to your guest today.
Good. Go ahead.
My first time when I listened to her, it was when they were in the ad hoc committee for SABC.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously, this is a lady that wants to work for South Africa. She is a servant, in fact. But I just want to ask her what she can tell us, because we have been voting for ANC to go and do things, not to talk about things, because we as citizens, we are not allowed to do things, but to talk about things. Then we send a message to our leaders to make things practical, like land. We have been telling our leaders we need back our land.
Yes.
But they have been talking about it since from 1994 until today.
Pagamani raises a very interesting point, and please feel free to respond to anything he asks. But that gap between ideas, policy, intention, and practice, how do you understand that? What is that all about? Is it people getting distracted, or is it ideas being overambitious? What is it?
I think that it's possibly the ideas overtaking reason.
Yes.
If you know what I mean. Like, for example, on the issue of land, number one, when you are deciding that you are going to redistribute land. First of all, the country has to put the issues of food security first.
Yes.
In other words, you must have a special dispensation for those farms that are producing food for the country. You can't just have a blanket thing of saying we are going to expropriate land irrespective. So you need to prioritize that, because food security is very, very important for any society. Secondly, when you are going to be dealing with this redistribution of land, you also have to take into account that not everybody who wants the land wants to be a farmer. And therefore, you need to come with a different dispensation for those. My view is that sometimes we come with size one fits all kind of solutions, and we don't take into account some of these critical aspects. In other words, our ideas become so disjointed from the practical realities.
Let's hear from Mahluleli, who is calling from Kempton Park. Hi, Mahluleli.
Hi there, how are you?
Well, and you?
I'm all right, man. Mam Khoza.
Yebo.
Siyabonga, ma.
Ngiyabonga nam.
As a child born after 1994, a lot of the times when we hear, a lot of the things that we know about the ANC are things that we have been told about, things that we have heard about. And more often than should be the case, the things that we see around us are not reflective of the ANC that our fathers and our grandfathers speak of. And having watched you with SABC inquiry, we saw that within the ANC structures, there are still people and there are still individuals within there who are still pushing that same mandate that was pushed by those people back then. And we are really appreciative of that, ma'am.
Mahluleli, thank you. And I want to build on Mahluleli's call to you, Dr. Khoza, and add to that what Lepile has posted on our Facebook page. And here we go. John, your guest could be very useful in an organization like the EFF. Can you ask if she would ever consider leaving the former liberation movement for a place in a party that would appreciate her wisdom and intellect? Is it your political goal and conviction that the main thing you need to do is get the ANC right rather than get the ANC out?
To be honest with you, I honestly believe in the ANC policies.
Yes.
Unfortunately, those that are meant to implement these policies, they betray that mission. As for the EFF, I respect the people that are in the EFF, but I honestly do think that some of their policies are catastrophic to the economy of this country.
What in particular?
Well, I mean, the EFF, they are talking about issues of expropriating land without compensation, and I think that flies against the Constitution. But secondly, I also don't like their idea of nationalization. The truth is, when you give the state to actually run the mine or to run a particular specialized environment which needs a lot of capital investment anyway,
yes,
you are actually failing that country. I used to be a student in Zimbabwe, and I remember during that time when I was a student in Zimbabwe, the government even owned hotels.
Yes.
And those hotels were not well run. And the government has to allow private capital to inject in the economy. And the only way to create a very competitive society and to be able to have prices going down is by creating that competitive environment. And that is why I'm not a communist.
I want to ask you this, though, because you say the ANC, in your view, has good policies. The question, though, as to what the ANC's policies are around the economy is seemingly a moot point. Is radical economic transformation a long and old-standing policy of the ANC as you know it, or is it an attempt from a political platform to recapture some of the ground that they perceive they might have lost to the EFF on the left?
Let me tell you something. My view on radical economic transformation. Number one, I think we have different interpretation of what radical transformation is. To me, if we are going to talk about radical transformation, we need to be talking about increasing the intra-Africa trade. Currently in SADC region, for example, we are still standing at 12%. Why? When we have Statistics General is telling us that there are only 1,000 products that we consume as Africans, throughout Africa.
Yes.
And we have not been able to do that. But other people indeed are using radical economic transformation to make themselves relevant, when in fact they are actually pursuing their own personal interests, their own interests of enriching their families and friends. And I don't call that a radical economic transformation.
Before we run out of time, because I'm mindful we have Lunwabo holding from Pretoria, but I do want to make sure that I get this question in. From everything I've read, and I had a great set of documents prepared by the show's producer, Makhosi Khoza, you've been threatened with death a number of times. You've had people invade your home. You very recently attended an inspection of a hospital in Mpumalanga in the Bushbuck Ridge area, if I'm not mistaken. Following your comments about that and your dismay at what you saw, there were death threats. How do you deal with that? Are you fearless?
Well, I'm not a suicide bomber.
Yes.
And therefore, I don't believe that if I do something, if I die now, I'm going to get rewards in heaven somewhere. Yes, I do take care of my life, but I'm not intimidated by that. And unfortunately, that's how we've degenerated in terms of politics in South Africa, where when you are genuinely performing your oversight function, you get threatened by the members of the executive. It has happened and it's happened again. So I get that all the time. But the reality is that if we are fearful, there's very little you are going to achieve in this life, because each time you will be intimidated and you will stop pursuing your real goal.
In addition to the threats which you've responded very clearly to, are you faced by a certain amount of chiding where people say, Dr. Khoza, maybe you don't properly understand this? In other words, saying, know your place. Is there a fair amount of that as well, or do people not bother?
Well, it happens a lot. I get that a lot.
Yes.
I get that a lot. I get summoned and here and there. No, you've said this thing. You shouldn't have said that thing. You should have sugarcoated. And I can't sugarcoat. I love this country. And one of the things that I think our leaders must understand is that we respect them, but we love our country more. We can't do everything for them at the expense of the country.
I want to make sure Lunwabo gets a chance, holding for a long time from Pretoria. Hi, Lunwabo.
Good evening, Dada John, and good evening to you, Dr. Khoza.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, mine, John, in fact, is not a question or a comment, but more of a compliment to Dr. Khoza. I've heard about her when she was still in KZN, and she has explained that the province, while I was listening to her just passively. But I listened with applied mind during that subcommittee, where I was even asking some colleagues, I said, no, I doubt if this lady is an MP for ANC. And I've been wondering all along to say, because I used to be a member of the ANC, but I left it when the ANC started now to embark on a mission of mental and intellectual genocide.
We're going to have to leave it there. I just want to mention to Prof. Gumede, who has posted something on Twitter. It's a specific message for Dr. Khoza. I will pass that on to her. A final question for you. I mean, we get the last caller, Lunwabo, saying, I saw you on television. I thought you can't be from the ANC. You could either take that as a compliment or you could take it with a sense of deep sadness, given that this is the party that you've devoted your life to and which you say tonight you deeply love. Which is it?
It is saddening.
Yes.
It's definitely saddening. I mean, the party that I became associated with when I was 12 years old, I can see it disintegrating before my eyes and possibly even perishing before my eyes. I cannot celebrate the fact that in 10 years, we've lost 5 out of 8 metros. I mean, that's staggering. If you understand the economics, you know that metros are your economic hubs. If you lose metros, what are you left with as a party?
Many, many thanks, Dr. Makhosi Khoza, joining us here on KFM 95.9. We'll have to invite you back, but that's all we have time for tonight. Thanks for joining us here on KFM.
Thank you very much, Sean.
And that's it from me, right.